Okay. Be careful if you're shoveling snow because there might be ice underneath it. And I think I'm going to leave the rest of the sidewalks the way they are for right now until we get some ice melt. These cold temperatures aren't doing us a whole lot of favors in that department. But we do have a chance to gather tonight, and we'll take a look at Job chapter 12 again, as Job is going to respond to Zophar. And actually, a couple of times in this response, he alludes back to all three of them, since everyone has had a chance at him now. But let's start in verse 12, and we'll read down through verse 25. We're not going to get that far tonight, but it's kind of all one section, so we'll deal with it together here. With the ancient is wisdom, and in length of days understanding. With him is wisdom and strength, he hath counsel and understanding. Behold, he breaketh down, and it cannot be built again. He shutteth up a man, and there can be no opening. Behold, he withholdeth the waters, and they dry up. Also he sendeth them out, and they overturn the earth. With him is strength and wisdom. The deceived and the deceiver are his. He leadeth counselors away spoiled, and maketh the judges fools. He looseth the bond of kings, and girdeth their loins with girdle. He leadeth princes away spoiled, and overthroweth the mighty. He removeth away the speech of the trusty, and taketh away the understanding of the aged. He poureth contempt upon princes, and weakeneth the strength of the mighty. He discovereth deep things out of darkness, and bringeth out to light the shadow of death. He increaseth the nations, and destroyeth them. He enlargeth the nations, and straighteneth them again. He taketh away the heart of the chief of the people of the earth, and causeth them to wander in a wilderness where there is no way. They grope in the dark without light, and he maketh them to stagger like a drunken man. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, tonight as we continue looking at Job's response to his friends, it's always impressive that he keeps bringing up how great and grand and wonderful you are. And even though he is struggling and really wants to know why, the answer that he's going to get at the end of the book is the answer that he keeps kind of bringing up himself here, that you are great and grand and wonderful, and that's enough. And we so often want to understand, and so many times we want to know more, but the things that you withhold from us are because we really do not need to know. We can be successful if we don't understand what the outcome's going to be. And we can be encouraged realizing that you have everything under control when we absolutely do not. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. He started his section here in verses 1 through 5, and he's talking about their belief system, and he says their belief system is cruel. And then in verses 6 through 11, their belief system is trivial. If you really think about it, robbers get away with it and evil people get away with it sometimes. So according to them, this little equation they have of righteousness equals blessing and evil equals cursing doesn't even fit in the world that we see around us. So it's kind of trivial. But then he's going to go on a little bit of a lengthy section here, which he actually breaks into a couple of parts. But the whole basis of it is their system is limiting of a sovereign God. You're thinking that God only works in this way, does him a huge injustice, because God is so much bigger than that, and he's so much broader than that, and he thinks so much higher thoughts than we do. He starts off this set of arguments in verses 12 and 13, talking about their wisdom isn't omniscient, neither is it eternal. And it's an important reminder for these guys, because a couple of times they've said it's been my experience or it's been my understanding, and this is a little bit of an agreement with Bildad here, because Bildad at least said in chapter 8 verses 8 and 9, Job, you need to go back and consider the ancients. because we haven't been here all that long, so we really don't know all that much. So if you need to go back to the ancients. And we talked back then about how they lived to be 800 years old and how much they could think about and how much they could do. Imagine. I mean, it's so hard for me to be able to try and wrap my mind around the thought that here's Adam, and we think he has passed on, and you've got generations and generations, but there's biblical history being written 700 years later, and Adam's still there. And in our day and age, you're lucky if you get to see 2 generations past yourself. But in Adam's day, my goodness, you could go hop up on great granddaddy Adam's lap. And if you wanted to know what it was like in the garden, you didn't have to listen to somebody else talk about it. You could just listen to him talk about it. And so you think of all the wisdom that would be passed down, not just from a grandfather to a father to a son, but you're talking about son can go up to grandfather, and he's not even, it's hard to imagine, Adam's middle-aged at 400. Wonder if he had a midlife crisis and invented a chariot. And I mean, it's crazy because our life is so caught up in such a short lifespan. And this encouragement here is, now hold on a minute, just because we are so limited, we got to be really careful that in our thinking we're not limiting the sovereignty of God. In verse 12 and 13, he's going to address this omniscient and eternal. With the ancient is wisdom, and in length of days understanding. Now, some of the commentaries say he's just talking about old folks here. And it is a true statement that old age brings wisdom and understanding. I'm going to qualify that and say most of the time, because I've seen some older people that don't have a lick of wisdom, understanding, or common sense. But for the most part, you do. If you Bildad's argument was, why don't you go back and consider history? Because they already did a lot of these things and they learned important lessons from it. And it's good for us to go back and consider history also. Search out their fathers, the folks who did it before them. And sometimes when you think about ancient history, it's amazing when you talk about modern history to kids nowadays, they're talking about long after you and I were born till now, because they think that's ancient history. I mean, Revolutionary War is so far removed from their thinking, let alone, anything that precedes that. But if you're taking his argument here, I don't think he's talking about the fact that even though they had more opportunity to learn from each other, and they had an awful lot of opportunity to learn from experience, and so these guys would learn this, and these guys they would share information, and we see that happening at the Tower of Babel until God confounds their language and separates them. They are collectively bringing together their expertise to try and do something that God doesn't approve of. But he's saying, you can't forget about who God is. And I feel like even though it's true that old age brings wisdom and understanding, that's not necessarily what he's talking about here. He's minimizing that because he says the ancient is wisdom. I believe he's talking about God in verses 12 and in verse 13. If you think that you are ancient, he is eternal. If you think that man can learn a great deal in 800 years of living, if you think that man can learn the Tower of Babel, and what's interesting is you go back to Genesis and it says, and God gave them wisdom and they learned to work with metal and they learned to play musical instruments, and over and over and over again you can look through those early things, and God is giving them the wisdom and they're doing all these incredible things that man hasn't done before. But who did the wisdom come from, is what Job's point is. You forget that all that wisdom came from somewhere. And God is eternal, and so his perspective is way, way, way beyond our perspective. In length of days is understanding. We think 20 years is a long time to do something, and God thinks in time of, well, he made a promise to Adam and Eve in the garden, and how long was it before Jesus Christ was born? And here's Eve naming her kids like, maybe this is going to be the one, maybe this is going to be the one, maybe this is going to be the one. And 800 years later, when they pass away, it's not even close. And he makes a promise to Abraham, and he says, listen, I am going to give to your descendants, I'm going to give you this land. And we're thinking, okay, let's start right now. Who are we whipping first? But it's 400 years in slavery in Egypt, and we don't, it doesn't make sense to us. If man were writing the account, man would write it some other way, because we'd be prospering over here somewhere instead of being slaves. But when you have thousands of years and millions of years, the understanding of time is completely different from ours. And so he is reminding them of that. With him is wisdom and strength. He hath counsel and understanding. Verse 13 is like a mini masterpiece. Because what he's going to do here is he reminds them that he is eternal. And then he reminds them that he is omniscient. All wisdom and understanding comes from him. 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 29 and 30. We're familiar with Solomon. So wise that soon the fame started spreading abroad, and people were coming from all over the world. And it was obvious that God was working in him in a way that most folks weren't. Exodus 35:31. God moved on him with wisdom and understanding. Proverbs, whole book of Proverbs, whole book of Ecclesiastes. I set my heart to know what everything was like under the sun. And I found it's all empty until I started adding God into the equation. That's the whole premise of the book of Ecclesiastes. And Job is reminding his three buddies here that sometimes your calculations and your way of thinking are forgetting about God. And so we get down here to verse 13, and he is going to remind them with these four descriptions, if you will. With him is wisdom. Wisdom is knowing what to do, or knowing what needs to be done. And then he says, and strength. He is omnipotent, and that's being able to do it. It's one thing to know what needs to be done, and a whole nother thing to be able to do it, because sometimes you don't have the strength to do what needs to be done. And then he says counsel. The word means to plan, or to give purpose, or to advise. That is really interesting, because man thinks he knows what he's doing, and he's going to talk in these later verses about how he raises up leadership, and then at the very end, 22 through 25, how he works in nations themselves. And as he goes through here, you realize that man has a plan and a purpose, and they think they're so smart, but God's the one that has counsel, and that's the why. The why something needs to happen. And then you have the word understanding. It's skillfulness, it's reasoning, and that's the how best to do it aspect. In other words, what Job is telling them here, boys, you keep telling me that I have sinned and therefore I'm being judged, and so I need to just repent of my naughty little heart, and God's going to turn everything around and everything's going to be better. And he's already given them some examples of how that doesn't work. But now he's reminding them, just hold on a minute here, because the one who is in control of all this has wisdom, strength, counsel, and understanding, which means he's the one that knows what to do. He is the one that's able to do it. He knows why it ought to be done, and he is skillful in understanding. He knows how best to do it. In other words, God knows every single detail of a situation. Y'all ran in here on your camels and parked them over there next to the trash heap, jumped off and stared at me for a week, and now you're weighing in on this thing, but you haven't even considered all of the aspects of what's going on. You don't know near the detail that God does. And that's why he wishes he could call on God and have him say, why? So he is omniscient and eternal. but he is sovereign over creation. Verses 14 and 15. Behold, he breaketh down, and it cannot be built again. He shutteth up a man, and there can be no opening. Concept here. God alone can create. So if God alone can create, then God alone can annihilate or utterly destroy. Now, if you think about it, man can manipulate creation. He can change creation. You can go into a lab and work on some molecules and create plastic, and you can create rubber, and you can create butter, one molecule away from plastic. Margarine. That's why you ought to get it out of a goat, a cow, a horse, or something, rather than out of a lab. I mean, seriously. Margarine's manipulated, and it's the same stuff as you don't want to know. But if it tastes good to you, so much for you. God provided a natural way. We're not going to get off on that. But God alone can create. Let's go into a lab and see if we can create a sheep without having a sheep. Well, you got to have the basic building blocks of a sheep before you can grow a sheep in the lab. Because a rule of science that nobody has argued against, matter can neither be created nor destroyed. It can be changed, but it can't be created or destroyed. Now, let's look at the application of it. Behold, he breaketh down, and it cannot be built again. Now think of the total political destruction of Nineveh. Nineveh has not been rebuilt again. Or Babylon. They might build a city right near it or pretty close to it, but Babylon was totally destroyed politically. Or Persepolis, or Tyre, or you could go on and on. Listen, if he wants to, he can take a Pompeii and bury it with a volcano, and you won't want to rebuild it. I mean, you can't even rebuild in the close general proximity to it because it's buried. All you can do is excavate it and try and figure out what happened there. But we know what happened there. A volcano erupted. They didn't have a whole lot of warning, and most all of them were buried alive. The point here is, when God breaketh down something, you can do whatever you want to, but he has the ability to absolutely annihilate and utterly destroy it, and it's not going to be built again. Total destruction of empires. Where's the Assyrian Empire? Because at one point, I mean, they were so great. Where's the Babylonian Empire? Where's Nebuchadnezzar's great grandson sitting over there looking out on his magnificent empire saying, oh, I'm the greatest person that ever lived because I have the biggest empire that's ever been. When God annihilates something, it's gone. Or what about the Greeks, the Grecian Empire, or the Roman Empire? And he can so severely limit an empire that even though it remains a country, it's almost powerless. And the Egyptians are an excellent example of that. He drowned the mightiest army at the time in the Red Sea, and they never recovered from it. Now, do they have jet airplanes, and do they have a military, and do they have? Absolutely. But you take 5 or 6 countries that decide that they're going to invade Egypt, and who are they calling on for help? They're not doing it themselves, because they're not that big an empire. God just cut them off at the knees, and they haven't been much since. Because, Job is reminding us, he has the power to do that. Now look at the second part of it. He shutteth up a man, and there can be no opening. God can frustrate the plans and purposes of anyone. We're going to use Haman a couple of times, and I'm going to try not to call him Naaman. Okay? Just let me know if I do. Haman, boy, he thought he was the bee's knees. We'll look at him here in a minute. And what happened? Swinging in the breeze. I don't know if you're much into history, but sometimes I watch things on the History Channel, the greatest discoveries, blah, 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 blah. And some of those things include stuff that the Nazis were doing. And when you go back and you watch some of the things that were happening back then, you just got to shake your head and say, how the world did they not win the war and just absolutely dominate the whole world? Because we're flying around, in little propeller planes, whee, and here comes a jet. What? Hitler had jets? Yeah, Hitler had jets. Hitler had guns. These things are shooting miles and miles and miles way beyond what anybody else is. They're still trying to find the formula for Hitler's concrete. There were incredible minds at work, and they were doing absolutely horrible things with the genius that God gave to them, and yet He did not allow them to do what they were intending to do. And over and over and over again, man, we got submarines that are going to be able to run on hydrogen peroxide. You don't have to come up to the surface. Because when the engine runs, it produces, and then you turns this into hydrogen, which produces, and so it can go for a month. Could you imagine in World War II, if there is a submarine that doesn't have to come to the surface for a month, how dangerous it would be? The biggest battleship that they ever built. And you know what? It sank before it went into battle. What? You just kind of shake your heads. But that's what Job is reminding us here. Because they can work all they want to, and they can throw all their resources to it, and they can have a lot of brain power building a jet when people are flying propeller planes. But if God shuts up a man, there can be no opening of it. He says that in Revelation chapter 3, behold, if I close the door, nobody's opening it. And if I open the door, nobody's closing it. Just a reminder of who He is. Then he talks about natural disasters here in verse 15. Behold, He withholdeth the waters, and they dry up. Also He sendeth them out, and they overturn the earth. Now turn with me to 1 Kings chapter 8. Be familiar to you if you're not familiar with the address when we get there. The reason I want to look at this is far beyond what man is able to comprehend. In 1 Kings chapter 8, and look at verse 35. If I can keep from choking and dying. When heaven is shut up and there is no rain, because they have sinned against thee, if they pray towards this place and confess thy name and turn from their sin, when thou afflictest them. Now we're going to jump down to verse 37 here in just a minute. But I want you to hold right here for a second, because it says, when heaven is shut up and there is no rain. What do you do when there's no rain? Well, listen, you can throw chemicals in airplanes and fly them all over the place and try and seed the clouds if you want to. But if God shuts up heaven and there is no rain, guess what's not falling, no matter how many chemicals you spray on people? You just stand there and look up there, and at some point, the only acceptable alternative is to pray. Because it is a reminder, and it focuses us from how big and how mighty we think we are to, oh, wait a second, this is so beyond my control. The only thing that I can do is ask the only one that has control of this if He would send some rain. Look at verse 37. If there be in the land famine, if there be pestilence, blasting, mildew, locust, or if there be caterpillar, if their enemy besiege them in the land of their cities, whatsoever plague, whatsoever sickness there be. Can we control any of that stuff? Can you imagine what it must have been like on plague 6 or 7 for the Egyptians? I know you got Pharaoh and all his rulers sitting in the palace being all high and mighty, but the common people out in the fields dealing with plague 6 and then 7 and then 8 and then 9 and thinking, My goodness, dude, when does it stop? And how many of those folks that probably would have repented themselves lost their firstborn along with Pharaoh before he let God's people go? Far beyond any of our comprehension. Now, jump, if you will, to chapter 17, because you know this example. We're going to look at verse 1, then we'll go to 18 and look at verse 1. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. No rain. Well, okay, at least when the temperature changes, if the dew is settling on the grass, it can keep some stuff alive. But no dew and no rain, absolutely nothing to keep vegetation alive these years. Well, how many years? We'll see. We'll see how long it takes y'all to humble yourselves and have a change of heart. You go over to chapter 18, verse 1. And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go show thyself unto Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. You talk about stubborn-hearted people who are having a hard time seeing God the way Job sees God. It took them 3 years of no dew and no rain before they were ready to change. And I would suggest to you that 1 Kings chapter 18 verse 1 is God's mercy and grace, because it's not like the whole nation has flooded back to him in righteousness. No. There's awful famine and there's awful suffering in the land, and he's going to send the rain again to prove that he can withhold it and to prove that he can send it. We don't need to turn to Genesis chapter 7, but you want to guess what happens there? He can withhold it when he wants to, and he can absolutely send it when he wants to, because that's the flood. In Genesis chapter 7, verse 11 through 24, it tells us that water covered the entire earth 15 feet over the highest mountain. Now, there is probably some scientist or mathematician out there who thinks he's got figured out exactly how much water it would take to cover the whole face of the earth 15 feet over our highest mountain. But I just want you to know, when I was studying science as a youngster, they thought they knew what the core of the earth was made up. And they'd say, it's this deep with this, and it's this deep with this, and it's this deep with this. And then there's this molten magma center that, earthquake or the volcanoes and stuff are fed from. And I'm thinking, where's all the water? Your teacher would look at you like an idiot. Well, it said the fountains of the deep broke up. And all that water comes pouring out. And the windows of heaven were opened. And all that water came pouring down. You tell me how much water it would take to bury. How much water could we fit in Clinchco between Neely Ridge and Rose Ridge? 15 feet above the both of them. I mean, we've seen some flooding around here. But we're talking mind-boggling. And then after the flood, God says the waters assuaged and they seeped down into the ground. Can you imagine it? All that water went somewhere because the God of the universe is able to do that. He can control natural disasters. He can do things that absolutely boggle your mind. And Job saying, there is not a thing that man can do about it. Now what's interesting to me is he doesn't come right out and say it, but it is unspoken here, because if you're sitting here listening to Job and he's saying he can withhold the rain, 3 years of famine, or 3 years without rain causes a big famine. You remember in Egypt when Joseph was there were 7 plenteous years and then 7 lean years. Can you imagine how bad it was in year 7? I mean, that's incredible. That is an incredible famine. What does man do about it? Here's the unspoken question. Do you suppose that any righteous people die in natural disasters? If God can withhold the rain for 7 years in Egypt or for 3 years in Israel during Ahab's time, and it's a miserable, do you think there were some righteous people that were suffering and dying during that time period along with the ungodly? Well, I would say yes. And so here their thinking is, well, if you are a righteous person, God's just pouring out blessing on you and pouring out blessing on you and pouring out blessing on you. And if you're evil, He's judging you. But wait a second. Natural disasters happen to everybody. When a hurricane wipes out New Orleans and all around them, I am sure there were some righteous people that were affected by that. There's a problem with your thinking, fellas. In verses 16 through 21, we're not going to make it all the way through there tonight. He talks about being sovereign over leaders. Verses 16 and 17, He is always in control. With Him is strength and wisdom. The deceived and the deceiver are His. He is working in the deceived and He is working in the deceiver. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. They both think that they're in control. Right? If you're deceived, you think you know what's going on when you don't. But you think you're in control, and you think you know what life is going to bring for you. And if you are the deceiver, you're like, I got this guy right where I want him, and I'm in control of this situation, and pretty soon I'm going to own everything he has. But Job's saying both of them are wrong. The person that thinks they're in control but is deceived is wrong, and the person that is the deceiver but thinks they're in control is wrong, because God can raise up kingdoms and He can tear them down again. And so maybe He raises up a deceiver to accomplish something, and then their judgment, their destruction. Verse 17, counselors. He leadeth counselors away spoiled. That word spoiled is an interesting word. Might be better translated in English, stripped, because that's what it means. He leadeth the counselors away barefoot or naked. In other words, they got nothing left. That's the point. A counselor is somebody who was very important to the king. And so they had power, and they had a position, and they had money because he paid them well, and they were dressed well. And so you walk downtown, you'd be like, oh yeah, there goes so-and-so, you know. Our Congress and our cabinet, they wear pins and they have things that tell you, and you're like, oh wow, there goes an important person. That's Director of Homeland Security. That's the Vice President. That's whoever. But what Job is saying here is, listen, God can take someone who is a counselor who has all of these things, and He can send them away barefoot or naked. He could strip them of position. He can strip them of power. He can take those nice clothes away. He can take away the influence. In 2 Samuel, let's turn there, chapter 15. David is having problems with his son. And he has an advisor, Ahithophel, who is an important individual to him, but now he is going to become an advisor to his son Absalom that's causing problems. And in 2 Samuel 15 and verse 31, it says, And one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now, from a man's perspective, how do you think you go about doing that? How do you turn the counsel of someone who has a lot of wisdom and has given great counsel to a king before, has made really good decisions, they're flourishing economically in all kinds of ways because of what he has done? Well, jump over to chapter 17 and look at verse 14. turn what Ahithophel is going to say into foolishness. Well, he doesn't do the work in Ahithophel. That's what's interesting. In chapter 17, verse 14, it says, "And Absalom and all the men of Israel said, The counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel to the intent that the Lord may bring evil upon Absalom." So you see what's happening here? This isn't the way it goes down for man. A man would be like, well, make him lose his mind or suffer for something so that he's just rambling on and he's not giving good counsel. But that's not what happens. He is still giving good counsel, only God is at work in Absalom and the others, and they're like, yeah, you know what, we're going to listen to this guy because his counsel's better than you. And then if you jump down to verse 23, he realizes he's not being listened to anymore, and it says, "And when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and arose and gat him home to his house, to his city. And he put his household in order and hanged himself and died and was buried in the sepulchre of his father." Was he giving bad counsel the day he died? No. He was still giving great counsel because he was a wise man and a man of understanding. But God worked on the other side of things that nobody was listening, and he got so frustrated, he said, "There's no point in being a counselor if nobody's going to listen to you," and he went home and hung himself. God is able to strip all of that away. We're not going to turn there, but Haman, right? Esther chapter 3 and verse 1, the king promotes him above everybody else, and he is flying high. And in chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, he doesn't know it, but the noose is already tightening around his neck because he's in trouble. But he goes home to his wife and his counselors, and he's telling him, "I'm a rich man, and I have a lot of kids, and I have the world." It's going on and on and on and on. And it isn't too many days later that he's coming home from a banquet, and he's like, "Oh boy, I don't know. I thought the king was going to honor me, so I told him all this stuff because I couldn't figure out he would honor anybody else, and he honored my enemy." And then in chapter 7, verses 7 and 10, he knows he has angered the king, and he knows he's in danger for his life. Wait a second, being second in command in the whole country and having all these riches and bragging to all your friends, and now you're scared for your very life. And in verse 10, they're hanging him on the own gallows that he built, because God is able to strip down naked all the power, all the glory, all the riches, all the everything, and leave him empty. Last example, we're not going to turn there, Daniel chapter 2, verses 3 through 10. Nebuchadnezzar dreams a dream, but he gets up in the morning and he can't remember it. I almost never remember my dreams. I don't know what's the point of dreaming is if you can't remember anything. Can't remember them. But it's bothering him because he knew it wasn't good, and so he's troubled when he wakes up, but he just can't seem to remember the dream. So he calls the wise men in, and he tells them, "Tell me the dream and then tell me the interpretation, because this is really worrying me." And they're like, "What?" "I'll tell you what, king, you tell us the dream and we'll tell you the interpretation." He gets mad and says, "I'm going to kill all y'all." It's good Southern. "If you can't tell me the dream," and they say, "Never has this been heard before, because there is no man alive in the whole world that could do this." Nobody runs to Daniel and says, "We need some help." When the people show up to kill Daniel, he's like, "Hold on a minute, let me take a crack at this." And he walks in before the king and he says, "King, I can't do this. Those guys were right. There's no man alive in the world that can do this, but my God can. Give me one day." And God tells him the dream, and he tells the interpretation of it, and he walks back in there and he says, "My God is able to do this." And he tells him the dream and the interpretation. The king's like, "Oh wow, you're right. I don't really like the interpretation, but that's pretty incredible, Daniel." He stripped all the counselors down to nothing and revealed to them, "Boys, you think you're all high and mighty, but guess what?
This guy over here that doesn't think he's high and mighty knows who is high and mighty deservedly. And that's kind of what Job's doing here with his friends. Boys, you got a problem with your thinking. And part of the problem is, I don't know that you really understand who God is. He is able to do all of these things. He says he is able to make the judges fail. He's able to make the judges fail. Fools. I think of Samson. Poor old Samson. Boy, he thought he was everything. He is the strongest man around. I'll just pick the gates up and haul them off. I'll grab a bunch of foxes, tie their tails together, and create chaos. And he let a girl make a fool out of him. And God still used him. Or how about the Egyptian wise men? Because here comes Moses and Aaron, and they're doing this incredible stuff, and they're like, well, we can do that too. And God lets them for a little while. How do you think they felt the first time they showed up in the king's house, in king's court? And they were all ready to perform because they always had been able to perform, and all of a sudden they looked about as foolish as they could look. Or 1 Samuel chapter 4, verse 18. Eli is a priest, but it says in 1 Samuel 4:18 that he judged Israel for many years. And he had those two boys we're learning about in Sunday school, Hophni and Phinehas, and they're creating all kinds of problems, right? And when the Ark of the Covenant is taken, Eli is so shocked that he falls off the back of his seat and he breaks his neck because he's fat. That's what the Bible says. Or how about that one judge who was so chunky that the guy went in there and stabbed him with a dagger and he couldn't get his dagger back out because, it got lost in there. I'm thinking, looking a little foolish. And so proud and so accomplished, at least you think you're proud and accomplished, and you think you're doing something until you realize that you're wasting the opportunity that God gave you. And Job's saying, the way I look at God and the way that y'all look at God, they don't line up, boys. And you are limiting God by saying that he has to bless the righteous and he has to judge the evil when he is able to do all of these different things, and he does it how he wants to, when he wants to, in the way he wants to, because that's who he is. With him is wisdom and strength, power and understanding. And y'all are just kind of going on and on and on like babbling fools. Next week we'll get into he is absolute in authority in verses 18 through 21, and then the building up and tearing down of nations in verses 22 through 25. And Job has an excellent view of God, incredible doctrine here, and it's what's carrying him through the darkest times. It is an underlying message, if you will, that's going to lead us to the end where God's going to say, where were you when I did this and this and this and this and this and this and this? And then Job's going to realize, oh yeah, that's right. That's what I've been relying on all along anyway. My God is great. And he's not limited to some humanistic thinking that doesn't fit.